So we're now going to talk about the third kingdom, kingdom fungi. And there's about 100,000 species, and we're only going to describe maybe 77,000 of the 100. No, I'm just kidding. As we do for each of these kingdoms, I mean, for kingdom protista, how many organisms did I mention? You know, maybe 7, 8, I don't know. So we're just mentioning a few examples of these kingdoms, which each contain, you know, hundreds of thousands of organisms. Now, the members of kingdom fungi, and maybe let me just kind of introduce it this way. So, how would we define the members of kingdom fungi? Most of them are multicellular. There are some exceptions, but the majority of them consist of many cells. That's in contrast to kingdom Monera and kingdom Protista, which were exclusively single-celled. They are heterotrophs. You'd say, what does that mean? That means they feed on other things. Most of them feed on non-living organic matter. Just like we said, most bacteria feed on non-living organic matter. So they are decomposers, or another term that means the same thing is saprotrophs. Saprotrophs. And in fact, so the major organisms that decompose dead stuff and manure and feces and stuff like that are bacteria and fungi. In fact, in some ways, bacteria and fungi compete with each other as far as who gets to feed on dead stuff and organic matter. Now, there are some fungi, however, that are parasites. That means they feed on living things, including you. But that's not the majority. Now, the fungi include molds, and we all have a sense of molds because we've seen mold growing on bread, mold perhaps growing on fruit, on oranges or something like that. It includes mildew. Mildew is usually a term. These are not scientific terms, but I'm using words that we commonly use. Mildew you'll see like growing around a bathtub or on a plastic shower curtain. It'll have mildew growing. And if you're wondering what's going on, it's actually a mildew is like a mold, and it's actually feeding on the plastic curtain. And you'd say, well, how could it feed on plastic? And the answer is because plastic is an organic molecule. Plastic is made from oil. Did you know that? So oil, one of the major uses of oil, besides its use as gasoline as a fuel for your car, is all plastics are made from petroleum, from oil. You can see why we depend so much on oil. So since it's an organic molecule, plastic, the fungi can feed on it. And it includes mushrooms. Mushrooms are a fungus. So next time you put that on your pizza, think about that. And it includes something called a bracket fungus. And I'm going to show you what a bracket fungus is. Well, I'll just show it to you right now. We've got him back here. We'll see a picture of this in just a little bit. But has anybody ever seen anything like this, like attached to a tree? All right, usually it's kind of on the bark. You might see a few of them. So this is a fungus, kind of looks like half a mushroom, like, you know, half of a giant mushroom. We'll see a picture of that in a moment. That's called a bracket fungus. And, but there are yeast. Yeast are also a fungus, but yeast are the exception in that they are one-celled, unicellular. All right, so that's basically, you'll notice that a lot of the fungi are M words. Molds, mildew, mushrooms, a lot of M words. Now, the good news about this kingdom for you is that how we classify these organisms is so complicated. We're not going to subdivide this into phylum. We're not going to subdivide it into any other subgroupings. We're going to give you a few examples. We'll talk a little bit about yeast and a little bit about molds and mushrooms, but we're not going to give you scientific names of classes, of phylum or classes or anything like that. On page K1, So on page K1, this is just describing basically what I just told you. Here's the term saprotrophs, which are decomposers. There are, however, some parasites, as we've said. And how fungi reproduce, and we're going to see a picture of this in just a moment, is they release little microscopic seed-like structures called spores. And they release these little microscopic seeds or spores into the air or into the water, and they grow into more fungi. In terms of the most common fungi we've seen, we've all seen mold growing on bread and mold growing on fruit and so on. On page K2, the first of the fungi I want to speak about are the single-celled yeast. And we're going to put yeast out under a microscope. And all of you are familiar with yeast. You probably have seen packages of like Fleischmann's yeast that they sell in the market or other brands of yeast. And you put the yeast in to make, when you're making bread. Anybody ever do that? And the yeast makes it rise, right? So, literally when you add it to water, and all you're going to see, it's not that exciting, but when you mix it in water, all you see are these little microscopic cells. And so they're kind of in a dormant state in the package. And when you add them to water, it's not like they don't move, they don't really start swimming around, but that kind of reinvigorates them, and they start to reproduce. And you'll see some of them actually, when you look at it, dividing. All right. So and they do have notice they do have a nucleus. They are a eukaryotic organism. Now let's talk about yeast and why they're important to us. They are a type of fungus. And in case you're wondering, well, why are they a fungus and not in Kingdom Protista? I mean, after all, Kingdom Protista was single-celled organisms with a nucleus, and if yeast are single-celled organisms with a nucleus, then why aren't they in Kingdom Protista? And the answer is because they have an outer cell wall that is like a cell wall of other fungi, like molds and mushrooms, and it's nothing like the outer cell wall of a protist, of a protozoan. So it's got other characteristics that make it more like a fungus than make it like a member of Kingdom Protista. Now, the common yeast that we buy, that Fleischmann's yeast or whatever brand you're buying to make bread or whatever, is commonly called brewer's yeast. And you'd say, why do they call it brewer's yeast? Because we use it to make brewskis. You'd say, what's a brewski? Okay, to make booze, to make alcoholic drinks, to make beer. All right? And in fact, the scientific name for yeast is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And if you know Spanish, this much Spanish I know, cerveza is beer in Spanish, and that's Latin, cerevisiae. And Saccharomyces, myces means a fungus, and saccharomyces means it feeds on sugar. Right? So you've learned in lecture a monosaccharide, a disaccharide. Those are types of sugars. So that's how it gets its scientific name. So let's talk about, this biology class. You might say, yeah, all we have to do is study all this stuff. Who cares about it? He doesn't even try to make it interesting. I'm going to try to make it interesting today. Let's talk about how to make beer. When I was in college, I used to make a lot of beer. I don't make it so much now. I still drink it. But anyhow, so how do you make beer? Beer is actually made from barley. That's and it's interesting that of all the alcoholic drinks, beer is almost the most universal. You can find beer in almost, not every country in the world. There are cultures in the world where they don't drink alcoholic beverages. But in any culture where they drink alcoholic drinks, you will find beer. It's really universal. So one of my goals is to travel the world and taste every single beer there is. But anyhow, basically you take a barley. Now, all grains, wheat, barley, oats, they all contain a sugar called maltose. And in fact, in your lecture, you might have learned that maltose is commonly called grain sugar. So in fact, they refer to that maltose that's in barley as barley malt, if you've heard that expression. And they commonly add another plant called hops to give it a bite, but fundamentally it's mostly just barley. So here's how it works. The sugar that's in the barley is maltose, and that's a disaccharide. It's specifically made up of two glucoses joined together. That's maltose. And what you do is you just add the yeast in. You take the barley, you crush it, and you mix it in water, and you throw the yeast in there. Now, the yeast are living things. They're microscopic cells. They need food just like you need food. And they start breaking down the maltose sugar. If you allow them to live in an environment without air, which is called an anaerobic environment. Anaerobic means without oxygen. So what they do is the yeast first break apart the disaccharide maltose into two glucoses, and then they break apart the glucose into pyruvic acid. Now, if you have a different biology lecture teacher other than me, you've already covered cellular respiration. Is that right? So you know what I'm saying. If you have me as your teacher, I'm very old and very slow, but we will be getting into it very soon, for those of you who have me for lecture. And we will cover all this in tremendous detail in cellular respiration. If you want to get a head start, just watch my video on cellular respiration, which is now 110,000 hits. But anyhow, so the yeast break apart this sugar first into pyruvic acid, and when there's no oxygen, they convert the pyruvic acid or pyruvate sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The yeast is not doing this for our benefit. That's simply how it breaks down food to make ATP. And this process of converting pyruvate sugar, pyruvic acid, into alcohol is called fermentation. And that occurs when the yeast is unable to break it apart completely into carbon dioxide and water. And it can only break it apart into carbon dioxide and water if there's oxygen. And when there's no oxygen, instead of turning sugars into carbon dioxide and water, it turns it into alcohol and CO2. Now, how much alcohol is there in most beer? So there's an old winemaking term called proof. And beer is about 6 proof, most beer. And if you want to convert that to percent alcohol, you divide the proof by 2. And that tells you the percent alcohol. So if beer is 6 proof, 2 goes into 6, it's 3% alcohol. Now there is some stronger beers called stout malt liquors. Stout malt liquors. See how all the stuff you're learning today? And a stout malt liquor is 10 proof, or 5% alcohol. And you can get actually some foreign beers like Chimay and some others made in Belgium that actually have, that are closer to 12% alcohol, more like wine. But most beers that are commonly sold, like Budweiser and so on, it's like 3% alcohol or 6 proof. All right, so that's how basically beer is made. And in case you're wondering, like, do you want us to know that? Yeah, why not? So now that we've told you about how to make a beer, let's talk about how to make a few other things. Now on page K3, so here it's got directions on how to make other alcoholic drinks. It's showing why. Let's talk a little bit about this at the top right. So on the top right, basically you can take yeast and mix them with any food containing carbohydrates. So beer, we said, had maltose. That was the carbohydrate or sugar that's in barley malt. All right? And you just put the yeast in, it breaks apart the sugar and turns it into alcohol and CO2. Now, you can do this with grapes. Are there sugars in grapes? Yes, right? So you take the grapes, crush them, you got grape juice, throw some yeast in, and put them in a big vat where there's no air, there's no oxygen. And so what are the yeast going to do? They're going to break down the sugars that are in the grapes into alcohol and carbon dioxide. And this is called anaerobic fermentation, again, this process. Now, if the most wine is about 24 proof. And again, how do you convert proof into percent alcohol? You divide by 2, so most wine is about 12% alcohol. Okay, some is less. Occasionally get a bottle that's 14%. Now, most wine, so people when they buy wine, they'll have a red wine, they'll have a white wine. What are all these different colors and all that? Are there different types of grapes? Yes, are there green grapes and purple grapes and red grapes? So depending upon which grape you use, you get a different kind of wine. And so obviously there's all kinds of different grapes and you get all kinds of different wines. There's, you can have Concord grapes, which are purple grapes, and have Concord wine. There's a grape that's become increasingly more popular called the Shiraz grape from Iran originally. There's actually a city in Iran called Shiraz. And that's become increasingly popular, and you get a Shiraz wine. So it depends on whatever grape you use, that's the kind of wine. Now, some grapes, let's use the example of a Zinfandel. So a Zinfandel grape, which is commonly grown up in Napa and Sonoma County and so on, it's got a red skin, a red outer skin, and it's white on the inside. If they crush the entire grape, so then you get a red wine. It's called a red Zinfandel. Interestingly though, if you remove the red skin and you crush it, the inside of the grape is white. That's called a white Zinfandel. So the white Zinfandel is the same grape without the outer skin, which affects its taste a little bit. Sometimes they remove most of the red skin, but leave some, and that's called a pink Zinfandel or blush. So they've got red and blush and white Zinfandels. It's all made of the same grape. If you're really into this stuff, you can get a Bachelor's of Science in winemaking at UC Davis, which is, I think, something I mentioned I consider doing at one time. Now, if you're going to add yeast to anything containing alcohol, anything containing sugars and turn it into alcohol, there is a problem. Have you ever heard that if you drink a lot of alcohol, it can kill brain cells? What did I just say? Sorry. Okay. So alcohol, too much alcohol can kill cells. It can kill brain cells. It can kill liver cells. You probably have heard of that. It can kill any cells. And in fact, if the yeast are in this big vat of grape juice and turning the sugars of the grapes into alcohol, at a certain level of alcohol, it kills the yeast. So in fact, you can't really make any alcoholic drink naturally that's higher than about approximately 12%, 14% alcohol. Because when the alcoholic content in this big container or vat reaches about 12% alcohol, the yeast die. So then the yeast can't convert any more sugars into alcohol because the alcohol kills them. Now, over the time, people apparently have always sought a way of creating something with more octane. In other words, a higher alcoholic content. So how you can make something with a higher amount of alcohol is you can create an alcoholic drink, like wine, and then heat it and boil off the water, concentrating the alcohol. That process of heating it up and concentrating the alcohol as you get rid of the water is called distilling. That's called distillation. So when you distill wine, you concentrate the alcohol in a smaller volume because the water goes off as steam. And that turns wine into something called brandy. So all that brandy is distilled wine. It's made from grapes. And typical brandies are about 60 proof. Now we're talking, okay, because that's 30% alcohol. Now it's actually worth drinking. So you can basically take any food containing sugars, ferment it into an alcoholic drink, and then distill it into something even more concentrated. Just before I give you some examples of that, one last comment I wanted to make about wine. Most of the wine that we commonly buy, whether it's red wine or white wine, whatever it is, they have allowed the carbon dioxide to escape. But you can buy wine that still has the carbon dioxide. Didn't we learn in making beer that the yeast turn the sugars into alcohol plus carbon dioxide? Right? And beer's got those little bubbles of carbon dioxide. So what do we call it when you have wine with bubbles of carbon dioxide? Champagne. It's called champagne or sparkling wine or asti spumante. All right, so that's sparkling wine, that's just got the carbon dioxide bubbles in it. But if you allow the carbon dioxide to escape, then it's just regular wine. That's the only difference between champagne and regular wine. It's got the CO2 in it. All right, let's give you a few other examples. This is so much fun. So here I actually made a little chart. You'd say, are you testing us on this? I want you to know beer and wine. All right, the others I don't care so much. All right, but we'll give you some other examples. So people all over the world have been taking whatever foods they've got around that have carbs in them and have been turning them into high-octane alcoholic drinks. So now you're going to be able to go into a liquor store and really look like you're knowledgeable. All right, so if you take grapes, you ferment them, right, turning them into wine, and then you distill it, that's called brandy. If you take wheat, you'd say wheat. Well, isn't there maltose in it? Maltose is called grain sugar. So if you ferment the wheat and distill it, that's called whiskey. That's classic whiskey. And an example of a whiskey, there are different types, would be Scotch. Right? They even use the term like single malt Scotch and so on. It's whether it's a particular varietal. Classically in Russia and Poland, all right, they originally used potatoes. Now they would tend to use wheat. But whether you use potatoes, do potatoes have carbs in them? Yes, it's called starch, which is just a bunch of sugars. So whether you take potatoes or you use wheat, you can ferment it to distill it, and that's called vodka. All right, and boy, I'll tell you, you meet most Russians, boy, do they know how to drink vodka. I tried to have a drinking contest with a Russian once. I was totally, I could not compete at all. Totally made, it was embarrassing. All right. You can take rice, which people in China and Japan have done. You can ferment it and distill it, and that's called sake. All right? So you can basically do this, because again, there's carbs, there's starch in rice. Corn. So corn is indigenous to the New World, right? So, you know, everybody's thinking, what can we do with corn? They didn't know about corn in Europe. They never saw it before until they came to the New World. So the Indians or Native Indians are using corn. So the Europeans are thinking, hey, we're not going to just go and eat corn, you know, make tortillas, you know. We're going to go and turn it into an alcoholic drink. So they ferment it and distill it. That's called bourbon. So when you're buying Jack Daniels, right, that's corn made out of Kentucky corn mash, they call it. Now, of course, in Mexico, there's a cactus called agave. Again, there's carbs in sugars and all these food products. So you ferment it, distill it, that's called tequila. You can take apricots. Do they have sugars in them? Of course, it's a fruit. So you can ferment it and distill it, you get something called apricot brandy. This is a very common drink in places like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary. They call it slivovitz. You ever hear slivovitz? Okay, that's apricot, or actually that's plum brandy. Take that back, that's plum brandy. All right, eating plums are like apricots. And you can take sugar cane. This is what they did in Jamaica, man. So in Jamaica, they ferment it and distill it, and that's called rum. And a lot of your rums are 100 proof, 50% alcohol. Okay, so that's, now we're talking. So this is a little bit about alcoholic drinks. So you can see how important learning about fungi is. Back on page K3, so essentially everything that I've been telling you is written here. And again, I don't care that you know about vodka or sake, but I'd like you to know about beer and wine because, you know, that's common enough to be familiar with it. Now, on page K4, of course, the reason why many people are using yeast is not to make alcoholic drinks, even though it's referred to as brewer's yeast, but they're actually using it to make bread rise. So how does that work? So this is how I describe it right here. If you, when you want to use yeast to make bread rise, what you do is you mix the yeast with wheat flour, right? You got white flour. White flour is all just a bunch of starch. Starch is just a bunch of carbohydrates. Okay, it's a polysaccharide. Now, the yeast, you put them in there. What are yeast doing? They're feeding. They need food. They're living things. Just like that's why they made alcohol. They just broke apart the carbohydrates into alcohol to make ATP. So in this case, though, when you're making bread to rise, are you putting it in a big keg, in a canister, in a container without air? No, you just make the bread, you put it in the yeast, and it's sort of sitting out there in the air, isn't it? So there's oxygen. So the yeast are going to break apart the sugars, the starch, first into glucose, because starch is just a polymer of glucose, just a bunch of glucoses joined together. And in an environment with oxygen, the yeast convert the glucose first into pyruvic acid or pyruvate sugar, and then into carbon dioxide and water. So it doesn't form alcohol this time. It forms carbon dioxide and water, not alcohol and carbon dioxide. This is called aerobic respiration. The word aerobic means with air, with oxygen. So that's the difference. When you want to make alcohol, it's got to be in an anaerobic environment. So the carbon dioxide is given off by the yeast as they break apart the sugar, and these little bubbles of carbon dioxide get trapped in the dough. So there's little pockets of carbon dioxide gas that are being released into that gooey, sticky, gummy dough. Now, when you put the bread in the oven, when you heat a gas, what does a gas do when you warm it? It expands. Has anyone ever heard that term? So when you warm a gas up, any gas, it expands. If you had a balloon with a little bit of air in it, and you warmed it up in a warmer environment, the balloon will expand. If you put it in a cold room, it will contract. The temperature affects how much space that gas occupies. So when you put the bread with the little pockets of carbon dioxide trapped in the dough, and you warm it up in the oven, the CO2 expands, causing the dough to rise. So when you look at the bread or cake, all those little holes, all those little openings and pores are where little pockets of carbon dioxide were, and then it just escapes into the air. But the whole purpose of it was to make the bread rise. Okay, now that we've talked about that, let's talk about another fungus, molds. So we've all seen mold growing on bread, and we have some examples of mold growing on Petri dishes here. So this is a Petri dish with a mold. And when we look at it under low magnification, like just with a magnifying lens, we actually see with a low power magnifying lens that what looks kind of fuzzy to us growing on bread or on a Petri dish is in fact these little structures that look like this. This entire mass is called a mycelium. This is called a mycelium. The word for a mold. And when we look at it with a magnifying lens, we see it has these little filaments called hypha. And in case you're wondering, like, do we have to know that word? Yes. These are hypha, and it's got these rhizoids, kind of root-like structures, and you will see these little ball-shaped structures at the top of the hypha, which are called sporangia. The sporangia are for reproducing. And what happens is spores, little seeds, develop inside these sporangia, and then the sporangia opens, releasing these little microscopic seeds or spores. So now they're released into the air. So in fact, in your kitchen, you can't help it. There's spores everywhere. There's spores in this room. So if you just open up a bag of bread, there's little spores of the bread mold that are going to land on that bread and start growing. So even when you go and close the bag, I can promise you that little spores have already landed on the bread just when you open that bag. And within a few days, you're going to see mold growing on that bread. All right, so it's just growing there all the time, and it gets bigger and bigger as it feeds on the bread. So that's how that works. Let's look at another picture to help us visualize this. Look on the next page, K5. On K5, this is kind of an enlarged view, just showing this mold, as it were, growing on bread. And if you look on the next page, K6, this just shows how, on K6, how the spore, this little microscopic seed-like structure, starts to divide into a multicellular mold, or mycelium. And of course, it can only do that if it lands on something that it can use as a source of food, such as bread, or an orange, or anything else. All right, so that's how it grows. Let's mention a few other molds specifically. Back on the previous page, K5. So I mentioned that in the middle of page K5, in the middle of page K5, we mentioned that because mold spores are everywhere, and they can land on anything, any food, and cause a fungus to start growing on that food, that's why so many foods, including bread, they have added chemicals called preservatives. A preservative is something that inhibits the growth of a fungus or a mold. So most bread that is purchased in the market has preservatives in it. And so it gives it a little bit longer shelf life before mold starts to grow on it. If you buy bread from a bakery, if you buy bread from an actual bakery, they don't usually add preservative chemicals. And while the bread tastes fantastic, it goes bad really quickly. Usually within 3 days that you've got mold growing on it. So without that preservative, it grows quickly. Now we also use molds for beneficial purposes, just like we use yeast to make alcoholic drinks and to make bread rise. So in fact, there are a whole bunch of cheeses made with molds. We had previously mentioned using bacteria to make things like yogurt and cottage cheese and Parmesan cheese. Well, we use molds to make cheese. When you eat blue cheese or Roquefort cheese, for those people who like it, you know what that blue stuff is? That's a mold on the growing on the cheese. That's what gives it its flavor. And same thing with brie and camembert and gorgonzola. Gorgonzola, these are all made with a mold. And so when you actually look at the cheese, you'll see that little bits of mold growing on it. That's what gives it its flavor. All right, on K6, though, the most famous and perhaps the most important of all molds is a blue-green mold known as penicillium. And penicillium, which is a kind of bluish-green mold, is the source of a chemical called penicillin. So how we get penicillin, which is an antibiotic used to kill bacteria, this is page K6, is how we get it. The source of this antibiotic is it is a chemical that is extracted from this mold. Now here's an interesting question. Why in the world would a mold produce a chemical that kills bacteria? Yeah?
To reproduce?
No.
They're competing for the same food supply.
They're competing for the same food supply. Didn't we mention didn't I say that there are two kinds of organisms that decompose, that feed on organic matter, that compete for the same food? Bacteria and fungi. So in evolutionary theory at least, the idea is with some fungi, certain molds, produce chemicals that kill their competition. So they've got more food to feed on. So think about it, if a bread mold is feeding on the bread, why don't bacteria grow? Because perhaps that bread mold produces chemicals that prevent the growth of bacteria, because bacteria feed on non-living organic matter as well. So in fact, many, many important antibiotics that are used to kill bacteria are obtained from different molds or different fungi. So that's the reason why they're found there. And incidentally, if you've heard of, everybody's heard of penicillin, ampicillin and amoxicillin are derivatives of penicillin. So they're a whole family of penicillin antibiotics. If you've ever heard of erythromycin, erythromycin is another antibiotic obtained from a different mold. So so I think that this really is a classic example that is given of why sometimes people wonder, why would professors, why would researchers, why would the government ever want to spend money studying molds? I mean, is that, don't we want to cure cancer? So why are we spending money studying molds? And the answer is because we never know where we're going to find the answer to something else. If nobody had studied molds, we never would have discovered antibiotics. And penicillin was first discovered in 1940 by Alexander Fleming. He wasn't looking to find an antibiotic. He actually found that wherever this mold was growing, it prevented bacteria from growing, and he started analyzing that. So it was totally serendipity that he discovered it. It was just by chance. So as we look for cures for cancer, who knows where we're going to find the cure for cancer. Some of you may have heard that one of the most important drugs for chemotherapy against breast cancer and ovarian cancer is actually a chemical extracted from trees that grow in old growth forests up in Oregon and Washington. This is the source of it'll come to me now, I just forgot the name of the drug, but it's one of the most important drugs that's used against breast cancer and ovarian cancer, a source of chemotherapy. It comes from the taxa plant, but I'll think of it. Anyhow, let's talk about another fungus, mushrooms. So what is a mushroom or a toadstool? A mushroom is actually the reproductive structure of a fungus, a mold growing in the soil. So here's this mold or fungus growing in the soil, and it grows up and forms this like umbrella-like thing, this tree-like thing we call mushroom. And what is released from the underside of the mushroom are those little microscopic seeds called spores. So that's really just the reproductive structure. The underside of the mushroom is called the gills. And if we look on the next page, K7. On K7, so it just shows, here's the stalk of the mushroom, and some of them have an annulus, and I don't care if you know that, and then here's the gills and the cap, and they release the spores. Now, here it shows that as it releases the spores, let's say we had one mushroom, and incidentally, where do we see them growing? We see them growing like on our lawn, we see them growing, and actually they can only grow in soil where there's a lot of organic matter. So there has to be a lot of dead leaves or manure or something there for them to feed on. You're not going to see mushrooms growing in sand. Okay, it's got to be rich soil, high in a lot of dead leaves or organic matter, because that's what they're feeding on. That it's really a fungus growing in the soil. And so if the mushroom releases spores, let's say we had a mushroom right here in the center, right there. When it releases the spores are released, and that creates what's called a fairy circle. Any of you ever hear that term? A fairy circle? Because basically the spores are all released 360 degrees around the original mushroom, forming a whole bunch of future mushrooms right around. That's called a fairy circle. Or a fairy ring. Maybe you heard the term fairy ring. Okay, anyhow, let's talk a little bit about mushrooms. There are very few mushrooms that we have been able to cultivate and grow in domestic production. So in markets, there's really very few mushrooms that you can buy. Most mushrooms still grow out in the wild. And that makes them very expensive because somebody's got to actually go out there and collect them because they are not able to cultivate or grow them. The most common one that they do sell in markets is the white mushroom. You don't have to know the scientific name, Agaricus campestris. But there are all kinds of more exotic mushrooms. However, you got to be really careful about mushrooms because there are some poisonous mushrooms and there's hallucinogenic mushrooms. So an example of a poisonous one is called Amanita phalloides. I'm not asking you to memorize the name or anything, but if you were out collecting mushrooms thinking, okay, I'm just going to go and collect some wild mushrooms and eat them, if you get a hold of that one, you'll be dead within 3 to 4 days. There's no cure. All right? It's called the death angel.
Do you have a picture of that specifically so we know not to?
Okay, I'm going to explain that you don't want to rely on a picture. Now, some people go out collecting mushrooms because there's hallucinogenic mushrooms. That means they contain chemicals that cause them to hallucinate. You know, so instead of buying LSD, they can just eat a hallucinogenic mushroom. An example of that is psilocybin mexicana. That's the source of a hallucinogen called psilocybin. So, but here's the problem. So it was suggested, where's a picture of the mushroom so I know which ones not to pick? Here's an old saying. There are old mushroom hunters and there are bold mushroom hunters, but there are no old bold mushroom hunters. There have been experts in mushrooms who have guessed wrong as far as identifying it and ended up dying. So even mushroom experts have made mistakes. So the best advice I can give you, don't eat them. If you buy them only if you get them in a store, a market. They can be packaged or whatever. Don't go out and collect mushrooms. It's just too complicated. Remember I said that the classification of fungi is extremely complicated. On page K8, there are a whole bunch of fungi that you are less familiar with. And there are pictures of some of these here. One that you are familiar with, and I showed you just a little bit earlier, is the bracket fungus. That's this one you'll see growing on the bark of trees. And it's actually feeding on the organic matter in the bark. There's others, these are called puffballs. A lot of these you see in the forest. So if you don't spend a lot of time in forest looking for fungi, you're not going to notice them. But that's where you'd see them. Let's talk about parasitic fungi. We've been talking about mushrooms that we can eat and so on. We did learn that there's some poisonous ones. Some of these fungi are parasites. They feed on living things. And they can feed on us. They can feed on other living things, dogs. They can feed on plants. And in fact, we wrote the most widespread and destructive diseases of plants, including crops that are grown for us, are fungal infections of plants. And these, the terms they use for a fungus growing on the leaves of a plant are smuts, rusts, rots, scabs, mildew, cankers, blights. These are wonderful terms. If you want to get a general sense of what it is we're talking about, look on the next page, K9. On K9, if you've got some leaves of your plants, any trees or plants around your home, if you see a bunch of brown spots, yellow spots, white things growing on them, those are all fungi. Because you would know what an insect is, right? You'd see if it was a little aphid or bug. This, you don't see a bug. It's just a discoloration, an orange spot, a brown spot, white, black speckles. That's a fungus. So they call them smuts and rusts and rots and scabs. And these are the most common diseases of plants. Back on the previous page, K8. So the most famous example of a fungus that literally changed history was a mildew. You don't have to know the name, Phytophthora infestans. This was a mildew, a kind of fungus that grew on the leaves of potato plants. And this devastated the potato crop in Ireland in 1846. And that was called the Irish potato famine. So for potatoes were an easy food to grow in Ireland. It doesn't take a lot of work. You just plant the seeds and potatoes grow and you pull them up out of the ground. Potatoes are not highly nutritious, but they give you carbs and energy. They don't provide much protein and so on. But they were commonly grown as the main staple, the main food that people in Ireland ate in the 1800s. And when this mold basically devastated the entire crop, as we wrote, 1.5 million people, over 1 million people died of starvation, and another 1.5 million people immigrated or left Ireland. Where did most of them go? The United States. And that's really how most Irish trace their lineage or their ancestry who ended up in the United States to the Irish potato famine. It literally changed the course of history, that famine. Now, as I mentioned right here at the bottom, so you may be thinking, yeah, so potatoes, they must have been like, yeah, Irish, they always eat potatoes, right? Potatoes are indigenous to the New World. They were indigenous to Peru. So before Europeans went to the New World, that began with Christopher Columbus, you'll remember, Europeans had never seen a potato. All right, they discovered it in South America, and like a lot of other things they discovered in the New World, they took them back to Europe. And they found that, hey, these aren't so bad, these potatoes. They're easy to grow. And so they started eating a lot of potatoes in places like Ireland, in Poland, and in Russia. A lot of potatoes, and that became very popular in those places to eat. But they were indigenous to the New World. Let me give you another example. I'm not only interested in alcoholic drinks, I'm interested in eating. So I'm also very interested in how foods have moved to different places in the world. So when we think of Italian cuisine, you go to an Italian restaurant, you think of pasta with tomato sauce. Well, we don't think there was pasta or tomato sauce before the year 1500 in Italy. We think that pasta, when Marco Polo of Venice, Italy, traveled to China, he discovered egg noodles. And he brought this idea of noodles of China back to Italy. Italy was a major city in international commerce in the late 15th century and early 16th century. So he brought pasta, the idea of noodles and pasta back to Italy. Tomatoes are indigenous to the New World. They're found in Mexico. The Europeans never knew what a tomato was until they discovered them in Mexico in the New World. Now, interestingly, there are plants related to the tomato in Europe, but they're poisonous. So initially, when the Europeans, mostly the Spanish, were the first ones to really go into Mexico and so on, but when they saw the tomatoes, they initially thought they were poisonous. So they didn't eat them. Then, there's a funny thing that the Europeans commonly did with foods that they initially thought were poisonous and later discovered they weren't. Once they knew that they weren't poisonous, because I guess they saw the indigenous Indians eating them, they arrived at a strange conclusion: they were an aphrodisiac. And if you don't know what the word aphrodisiac means, something that enhances passion and sexual appetite, sexual activity, makes you a better performer. So they thought it was an aphrodisiac. So they started putting tomatoes on everything in certain countries in Europe, especially Italy. So they thought it was an aphrodisiac. There is a nickname for a tomato. It's also known as, you may have heard this, a love apple. Have you ever heard that term, a love apple? It's big, red, and juicy. And so they called it a love apple. And they started putting it in all their food. And I think, so that came, remember Christopher Columbus only arrives in the New World, in the Caribbean, in 1492. So it wasn't until the 1500s that they started bringing in all these tomatoes into Italy. Marco Polo has brought back the noodles, and they start putting the noodles and throwing tomatoes on everything. So that created the whole Italian cuisine as we know it. And it was totally different before the 1500s. They didn't have tomato sauce, they didn't have noodles. So you might wonder, what did they eat? I guess they ate a lot of olive oil and wine, because they had olive trees and they had grew grapes. So that's mostly ate a lot of olive oil and wine. But then they started creating modern Italian cuisine. Let me mention a couple last examples because it's so much fun. Anybody ever go to Hawaii? So one of the things that people commonly do when they go to Hawaii is they bring back a pineapple. Anybody bring back a pineapple? Okay, well, good. It's good that you didn't. Because sometimes people bring back a pineapple and hand it to somebody here, like, we can't get pineapples here? Okay. Oh, thanks for bringing a pineapple. Yeah, I can buy a better one right in the market. The pineapples are grown largely in Hawaii, right? And who started planting all these pineapples was the Dole family. And that's why you've all heard of Dole pineapples. But were pineapples naturally found in the Hawaiian Islands? No, they come from Africa. And so the Dole family took pineapples from Africa and they said, hey, they will grow great in the Hawaiian Islands, so we're going to create huge plantations of pineapples. So there never were pineapples in the Hawaiian Islands until around the, I guess, 1800s. When the Dole family started creating these large plantations or farms to grow pineapples. Okay, a couple last ideas here. So I've given you examples of foods that were transplanted from one place in the world to another place, and it totally changed the cuisine or what we think about that place, like Italian cuisine or pineapples from Hawaii. There's some other examples. If you go to Chinese restaurants in the United States, you can buy something called chop suey. And you're thinking, yeah, chop suey, that's like real Chinese food. In China, they never heard of chop suey. It was created in San Francisco. Anybody know that? In China, nobody has ever heard of chop suey. It was something they invented in Chinatown in San Francisco that American taste liked. All right, so here's another example. So some of you have gone to restaurants or eaten what are called fajitas. So you're thinking, fajitas, yeah, that must be like Mexican, right? That's Central America. Latin America, they love fajitas. They never heard of a fajita. A fajita was created in Los Angeles. Is that true? Is anybody from Mexico or Central America? Did you ever hear of a fajita? Never. It was created in Los Angeles. That was a new food, and everybody thinks it's from Latin America. All right? Isn't that true? And a lot of the really spicy, quote, Mexican food is really Tex-Mex that was created on the border of Texas. That in real Mexico and Central America, they don't put all that hot, spicy stuff on. All right, like Tex-Mex food. So it's interesting what people create, and then we think incorrectly that it comes from a particular place. So, that's a lot of fun. On page K9, so we've mentioned diseases of plants that are caused by fungi. There are also parasitic fungi in us. And the fungi that grow on us primarily grow on our skin in warm, wet places on our skin. So athlete's foot is a fungus growing on your skin, like between your toes, and it's feeding on your skin. Your skin is a source of food for the fungus. It needs food to live, and your skin is it. And of course, typically, if your toes get kind of warm and wet between the toes when you sweat. Ringworm. Ringworm is a misnomer. It's misnamed. It's kind of a red ring on the skin where a fungus is growing. It has nothing to do with a worm. Crotch eczema or jock itch. That's where a fungus is growing in the groin. And it's simply warm and wet there around the groin, and so it tends to grow. Vaginal yeast infections. So it's obviously it's warm and wet, possibly in the vaginal canal or birth canal, and that promotes the growth of this fungus, the yeast infections. So I guess the lesson from all this is if you want to try to prevent fungal infections on the skin, you've got to keep your body cool and dry and not warm and wet for very long, because keeping it warm and wet promotes fungal growth. Yes?
What about like toenail funguses, you know?
Well, they can grow on anything. A nail is also organic matter. It's a protein called keratin. These guys just want to eat food, and they can eat anything that's organic matter. They can eat plastic, we said. That's organic molecules. All right, and the last, incidentally, there are antifungal drugs. If you've heard of monostat or other types of antifungal things, so these are different antibiotics to kill fungi. They are different from the antibiotics used to kill bacteria. The last example we want to mention of a fungus are lichens. And what is a lichen? A lichen is something that you'll see growing like on a tree, all right? And I know that most of you, when you see this, you're thinking, oh, yeah, that's moss. That is not moss. We will learn what moss is. This is a lichen. And in fact, the lichens can even grow on rocks. So if you've ever been traveling and there's a rock or something and you see like orange spots or yellow spots or green spots. Now obviously if you see on a rock as you're driving V13, that's a gang who wrote with spray paint V13. They tagged the rock. So if it spells out a word, that's not a lichen. But if you just see some color on the rock, and it's not like, you know, it spells out like a tag from a gang, but it's just like random spots on the rock, that is a lichen growing on it. That is a living thing. Has anybody ever seen like rocks where it just looks like some paint, and it's not paint? All right, now what is a lichen? It's actually a fungus with a blue-green algae living symbiotically with it. The color, whether it's orange or green or red, is due to the blue-green algae, which carries on photosynthesis. And what the fungus does, these are living symbiotically. This is a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. The fungus is dissolving the rock, and that rock acts as a source of minerals. The blue-green algae carries on photosynthesis, and together, symbiotically, they can grow on anything. So you will see a lichen growing on snow. Okay, just you can see this any place. On page K10, so we wrote at the top, this is an example of mutualism or mutualistic symbiotic relationship. So here's some examples of lichens.